Hello and welcome to Varn blog. And today we're going to talk about the elephant in the room. After all, why is it that so much of American politics, from QAnon to the most facile versions of internet Marxist-Leninism, seem to have emerged post Bernie Sanders? Why is it that the left, the floating family of belligerences that we call the left, has not been able to muster much opposition to the continuation of many Trump-era policies under Biden? And indeed, many members of the left have been proclaiming Biden the most progressive president since FDR. Now, the slight to Lyndon Baines Johnson aside, we must ask ourselves a question. What does it mean for Joe Biden to be the most progressive president since FDR when so many of Biden's policies are continuations of Trump-era policies? And we're going to talk about this in regards to the Restrict Act, the bipartisan bill that has everyone from AOC to House conservative Republicans crowing for it, proving everyone in many ways is a hypocrite. But also, just in general, from immigration to arms trades, Bidenism is shaking out to be not that different from Trumpism. Yes, on margin and on the particular details, there are differences. Biden is not interested in undermining many of the civic institutions of the state. Biden wants America to be perceived more humanely. And in the beginning, he seemed open to reversing some of the Trump era immigration restrictions, but this has all been scuttled. Yes, he opposed the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade somewhat reluctantly, but with no real effect. Yes, there is the most green parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is half of what we agreed to towards the Paris Accords, but whatever. It's the first time they've ever gotten that through Congress. But why is it the only bipartisan bill we've seen in many, many years, outside of the immediate COVID reliefs at the end of the Trump administration, is the Restrict Act? What does that say when we look at that in comparison with other Biden policies? Why all the furor about TikTok, leaving a lot of millennial leftists unable to decide if they even support the Restrict Act? Why is AOC talking about, well, we shouldn't ban TikTok, but we should support the Restrict Act? Now, there's been some alarmist reporting on the Restrict Act. I'm not going to lie. Much fear from the libertarian community about cryptocurrency, and they should probably fear that they're throwing their money in such schemes anyway. But in the belief that through provisions in the Patriot Act that almost anyone could be considered a foreign adversary, where that's pretty clearly delimited in the act. A lawyer tells me it would take, even with the Patriot Act, some real surprising legal finagling to get through a bunch of courts for that kind of interpretation to stand. However, this is still a pretty big deal, and one that proves the limits of many different things on the left. And this brings me to something that I think we have to deal with separately. And I'm going to share this. This is from the New Left Review's publication of Dylan Riley and Robert Brenner's Seven Theses on Bidenism. Thesis 7. And I'm doing a series on this that you're going to be seeing in the next month with some audience members and friends of the show. So I'm going to go into this a lot more detail. But Thesis 7. Bidenism's natural ideology is progressivism, not social democracy. There is one specificity of Bidenism that we have not yet emphasized sufficiently: its distinctive ideological profile. In direction and tone, the administration's policies represent the interest of an educated fraction of the working class within the context of political capitalism. I'm not going to get into all that today. I take this apart in my longer discussions on this. But because it is a party's obvious base, in this, Bidenism most strongly resembles late 19th century progressivism. The administration's social ideal is a market economy undistorted by monopolies, except they're totally okay with American monopolies, and managed by an open, meritocratically recruited, and diverse elite. That is part of their stated ideal. And that superficial bit is the difference between Biden and Trump. But in most substantive policies, it doesn't change anything. Let me continue. The tool used to implement this vision is the regulatory state, including metastasizing diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy, which has the side effects of providing well-paid purchase for members of the educated working class itself. The watchwords of this project are fairness and justice, terms which do not describe a social ideal at all, but a state of affairs among individuals. All of this is worlds away from notions of democratic control over a social surplus. We need a language to describe the new Bidenist project. Neoprogressivism is perhaps the best term, and the content and intention, it remains far from socialism as its social democratic and neoliberal forebears, but it is nonetheless a distinctive historical formation which must be theorized and studied on its own terms. Well, let me theorize this for you. Neoprogressivism, as conjured by Brenner and Riley, isn't actually substantively that different from Trumpism's response to our post-neoliberal moment. And I say post-neoliberal because what we're turning into gets banned, all kinds of names get banning around. Techno-neo-feudalism, Brenner has moved from that to political capitalism himself. But all of these things have a hard time describing what's truly different about right now than in the past. And the difference began all the way back in 2007 and 2008. That was a fundamental change in how we decided winners and losers in the rentier economy. And now that that is being reversed, we're seeing a new thing come about. But what is it and how? Well, Bidenism is not an answer to it because it is not a partisan project, even though it is sold as such. And I've described to you all how there is very little way in which the Democratic opposition to Roe v. Wade is going to do much beyond a state-to-state level. And in fact, in many ways, it's an ideal set of affairs for both parties, as now they can both use abortion restrictions to motivate their bases, even if, broadly speaking, a moderate Democrat approach is probably the most popular in the country. No. It's time for those of us on the socialist left, regardless of what we are, to really start pushing back on this neoprogressivism. To push back and talk about freedom and equality, not just equity, and solidarity in a real sense, but also to understand why these new ideologies, from MAGA communism to QAnon-esque Bonapartism, mystical Trumpism, and all this, has an increasing appeal. If you are told that Biden is the most progressive president and that Trump was a fascist, and yet there's a there's a not insignificant continuity from the way they handle TikTok to the way they handle immigration to the pivot towards China. How on earth is anyone supposed to believe anyone's rhetoric? And why would they not start just reaching for random ideologies, since they are not getting properly educated on anything anyway, to fill in the gap? When people are told that we are at more loggerheads than we've ever been before, I mean, have we forgotten that in 2021, regularly, even after the Biden election, after January 6th, many liberal outlets were running talk constantly of an impending civil war? Now, yes, if you ask them what they meant by civil war, they meant an uptick in political violence, and they didn't really mean organized armies, and they didn't really think that the government was actually in danger. And yes, there were upticks in violence. Hate crimes increased during both the Trump and Biden presidencies. Perhaps the executive office is not what is being represented here, and perhaps the government issue here is how obvious the changes should be. Brennan and Riley make one really important observation in the essay, and I'm going to link all the stuff I referenced, and I'm about to get to the Restrict Act here, but let's stay here for a minute. The observation that they make, that I think is actually crucial, is that Trump real breakage from standard Democratic and Republican continuity was perhaps in the beginning of his presidency with his appointing of paleo conservatives and all that, but he purged all those people. His supposed pivot away from Saudi Arabia didn't happen. He didn't end the wars as incompetently as Biden may have ended the Afghan war. He did actually deliver on his promise, something that he was even promising on all the way back in the Obama administration. No. Trump's incoherence during and up to January 6th is that he was losing control of the narrative. There was already signs before COVID that the economy was going to hit a recession, and that was going to be a problem for him. But beyond that, beyond all of that, Trump had to hold in a base that doesn't really believe in government protections and interventions, with a base that has no problem with populist moves, and had to implement a fairly educated and tactical administrative policy during COVID while seeming like he wasn't. Thus, according to Brennan and Riley, and I think truth, he would pander to one end of his mouth, anti-vaccine conspiracies, bleach, etc., while pushing the same policies, get the schools open, get the vaccine out, that Biden did. This led him to incoherent. And yes, there was a lot of grift, a lot more grift probably than what it had in the Democrats, with stuff like the PPP loans. But everything you've gotten from Biden that was not already going to happen under Trump has been heavily compromised and then largely undone by the courts, of which Biden has shown no real interest in actually taming, despite it being a consensus increasingly in his party that he should. Why is that? This is not to say that Biden and Trump are the same. They are not. But there is a continuity, and people feel it. So to continue to say stuff like Bhaskar Sankara has said, even as a critique, he was saying this is damningly faint praise for Democrats, that Biden is the most progressive president since FDR, is to condemn progressivism itself. Let's talk about the Restrict Act. The Restrict Act already should have us worried because it is highly endorsed by Republicans, Democrats, AOC, the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Security, and the Secretary of State. All have issued supporting documents endorsing the Restrict Act, a bipartisan bill introduced by a Republican and a Democrat that is very broad. Let me share with you Vice's reporting on this, because it's one that I think is more fair than a lot of the other alarmist reporting I've seen. The Restrict Act, proposed piece of legislation, provides one way for government might ban TikTok, but it contains, quote, insanely broad language that could lead other apps and communication services with connections to foreign countries of being banned in the US, multiple digital rights experts told Motherboard. The bill could have implications not just for social networks, but potentially for such tools as VPNs that consumers use to encrypt and enroute their traffic, one said. Uh, Although the intention of the bill is to target apps and services that pose a threat to national security, these critics worry that it could have much wider implications for the First Amendment. And as I mentioned, libertarians see this as paired with the Patriot Act in ways that are really scary. Now, I think the libertarians may be overstating their case, but there is a massive change here in the law. A lawyer friend of me says it breaks most of the Bill of Rights. The Restrict Act is concerning distractions with insanely broad language that raises serious human and civil rights concerns, said Wilmary Escatito, U.S. policy analyst for the digital rights organization Access Now. Do you know anything else about the Restrict Act? We'd love to hear from you. Reading the wrong thing here. Restricting the emergence of security threats that risk information and communication technology act led by Mark Warner, Democrat Virginia, and John Thune, Republican South Dakota. The pair introduced a bill earlier this month, which deliberately is not just limited to TikTok. Under the Restrict Act, the Department of Commerce, which is one of the more obscure departments in the executive branch, also with very little democratic oversight, would identify information and communication technology products that foreign adversaries have any interest in or poses unacceptable risks to national security, the announcement reads. The bill only applies to technology linked to a foreign adversary, and those countries that are listed in the bill as of right now are China, as well as Hong Kong, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. The bill's language also includes vague terms such as desktop applications, mobile applications, gaming applications, payment applications, and web-based applications. It also targets applicable software that has more than 1 million users in the US. The Restrict Act could lead to apps and other ICT services with connections to certain foreign countries being banned in the United States. Any bill that would allow the U.S. government to ban an online service that facilitates American speech raises serious First Amendment concerns, Caitlin Bogus, Deputy Director of the Center for Democracy and Technology's Free Expression Project, said. It told Motherboard in an email statement. In addition, bills like the Restrict Act may be motivated by legitimate privacy concerns. Binding ICE services with connections to foreign countries would not necessarily help protect American privacy. Those countries still obtain that data through other means, like purchasing it from private data brokers, and that is not made illegal by the bill. Escatito said from Access Now, as written, the broad language and Restrict Act could criminalize the use of VPNs, significantly impact access to security tools and other applications that vulnerable people rely on for privacy and security. Many individuals and organizations, including journalists, activists, and human rights defenders, use VPNs to protect their online activity from surveillance and censorship. The Restrict Act would expose these groups to monitoring and repression, which could have a chilling effect on free speech and expression. Many VPN corridors engage in misleading marketing practices, which exaggerate their importance and alleged security benefits. Used correctly and with a provider which has not introduced its own issues of logging users' traffic, VPNs can be useful for security. Rachel Cohen, a communications director for Senator Warren, responded by telling Motherboard that this legislation is aimed squarely at companies like Kaspersky, Huawei, and TikTok that create systemic risks to the United States national security, not individual users. So the threshold for criminal penalty in the bill is incredibly high. To ever be concerned about actions on YouTube, TikTok, VPN. I don't know if I trust that either. Before TikTok, however, it was Huawei and ZTE, which threatened our nation's telecommunication networks. And before that, it was Russia's Kaspersky lab, which threatened the security of government and corporate devices, Warner said in the statement at this time. We need comprehensive risk-based, proactively tackles sources of potentially dangerous technology that gain a foothold in America, which aren't playing whack-a-mole and scrambling to catch up with the art of ubiquitous. If Congress is serious about addressing risk to Americans' privacy, it could accompany far more by focusing its efforts to passing comprehensive legislation like the America Data and Privacy and Protection Act. Vogus said there's issues with that. In some ways, that would be worse, and I'll have to go into that in a minute. Now, one of the more worrisome elements of the Restrict Act is that, and I've read the bill, it would limit FOIA requests on how and why things are being pursued under this act. Meaning we just won't know, probably indefinitely, why things are being restricted because it's matters of national security. Now, this brings me back to a series of other things I've said today. The Restrict Act achieved something that Trump's executive order banning TikTok also attempted to achieve, but does so on much more strong grounds, but with a much broader and systemically applicable mandate. This brings us to another thing that we just have to deal with. The Democrats failed at anything but the Inflation Reduction Act as major legislative policy after the COVID provisions sunsetted. The Build Back Better plan didn't happen. So we got neither the infrastructure nor anything else that we wanted. Things that progressives promised to at least put on the table, such as Medicare for all and all the other things that were floated during the Trump years, were immediately removed. And I do remember people telling me, "Oh, Bernie Sanders being the head of the Senate committee he's on will enable him in reconciliation to deal with some of these problems." None of that happened. Now, I'm not here to tell you to run to the other side because, oh, well, if it's just between Biden and Trump, you might as well pick Trump, as many MAGA communists or whatever might tell you. I don't know what they would say, honestly. I can't follow their arguments. But I know that they're gaining in popularity. 5,000 viewers in a stream is not insignificant. Now, it's also not a political movement, but nonetheless, here we are. But Biden's pivot to China has continued. The tariffs have continued. The unification with NATO has really only been a result of Russia's response to Ukraine, which itself is a series of miscalculations in my mind by both Russian and American assets going back now almost 2 decades. Without which, the tensions between, say, the French foreign minister and Biden would probably still be high. Biden's Buy America agenda, which he pushed during his first year, was just as protectionist as Trump's, if not more so. Biden has not relaxed COVID era immigration restrictions only very recently. And even The Intercept has called his recent border policies plan to drape Trump's policies in liberal rhetoric. And while, yes, The Intercept has covered it, it has not really made many even socialist talking points. I'm not saying no one has. But the socialist response to Biden seemingly makes the differentiation between Democratic Socialists or the squad from just mere progressives almost impossible. And if the left has misunderstood that, as Robert Brenner says, and if there's the only bipartisan assistance we have is to expand American security state more and more into the realm of apps and close off the information system and close off and decouple things. Then we have to ask ourselves a question. Was Trumpism the result of a candidate? After all, as I pointed out to people, a lot of Trump's actual policies that made leftists and liberals so mad were normal Republican policies. Not that that makes them any better. It just means that the idea, for example, as often floated by many in the resist movement, that somehow someone like George Bush was a Marx improvement, that is unserious to me. We need to talk about Bidenism, because I'm not sure Bidenism is really that different than the other things that people have opposed. But it has changed the orientation of progressives. Socialists, I want you to think about freedom and not be afraid of it, as many of you have for a long time. Maybe it's too late. Maybe climate change means it's going to end, but you should reconcile that. I want you to think about equality, because if someone has to make you equal, you are not equal. I want you to think about solidarity, because that requires responsibility, advocacy, and seeing beyond immediate interest in ways that can sometimes feel unjust to people who've been harmed by other people who share their long-term interests. This is not to say that we have to just put away all of our differences or pretend that the racial, gender, sectional, regional, ethnic, religious conflicts that have plagued Western life aren't real. They absolutely are. But it does mean that justice for a larger group maybe is more important than symbolic recompense that does not bring justice to the great majority of people. We have to talk about Bidenism, because we have to talk about how both Bidenism and anti-Trumpism have left the left that grew and grew and grew in years of opposition, but is now wallowing and unable to define itself as something separate from a milquetoast progressivism, which doesn't even seem that different from what it was fighting as fascism merely 3 years ago. The continuity of American life means that the rhetoric we used has often been misleading, damningly so. Yes, there are many ways in which Trump was an absolutely dangerous Bonapartist figure and an authoritarian. And yes, there are ways in which the fractures of our democracy started showing, but they were there already. And we haven't fixed them. I see no evidence that anything more democratic in the small d sense is on the horizon. And with that, good day. Like and subscribe if you want more commentary. Have a good afternoon.